Ted came out in 2012 as the comedic debut from the mind behind Family Guy, Seth MacFarlane. The movie was a commercial success, eventually spawning a sequel and a spin-off television series. I had seen Ted around the time that it was released and had fond memories of the experience, though I was at the time more easily swayed by a curse word and an off-color joke than I am now, so take the opinions of my teenage self with a grain of salt. Recently I came across the movie whilst perusing Netflix, so I figured why the hell not. The movie begins with a depiction of a child who has an innate inability to make friends, John. Shortly after this description, John is gifted a teddy bear for Christmas, and shortly after that, makes a wish, bringing the toy to life and gaining a lifelong friend. Ted has a short-lived run of fame, as is to be expected from a sentient teddy bear, but this fame runs its course sooner rather than later, and before long, we find ourselves in the future with Ted and John doing bong rips on a couch. John is now 35, and it seems as if his life is going in no particular direction. He has a stable job and is ostensibly able to pay his bills and whatnot, but he spends most of his time hanging out with his teddy bear, engaging in puerile antics, much to the chagrin of his girlfriend Lori. This tension comes to a head in the most predictable of ways, with a sex worker taking a deuce on the floor of the apartment that is shared by the trio. Suffice to say, Lori is not thrilled about the turd on the floor, and Ted is strongly encouraged to move out. After acing the interview at a local grocery store, Ted and John are approached by an unsettling father-son duo. The father states that he has been following the story of Ted for a long time, and is interested in purchasing the bear. Both John and Ted decline the offer for any number of obvious reasons. Shortly after this encounter, John accompanies Lori to a party with her coworkers, having promised her that he's going to cut back on the childish antics that he and Ted have been engaging in, but he promptly breaks this promise to go do drugs with Flash Gordon. Lori finds out, and the two break up. John blames Ted for this, and attempts to end the lifelong friendship. With the pair now split up, Lori's boss leaps on the opportunity to ask her out, and she begrudgingly accepts. Ted pays a visit to the hotel room where John is living, and informs him of the situation, but John accuses him of lying, and attempting to drive a wedge through Lori and himself once again. A fight breaks out, but eventually the two make up and set out to reunite John and Lori. This attempt is less than successful, ending with John bludgeoning a man with a mic stand. The two do not reunite, but instead go back to their separate residences for the night. In the morning, Ted pays Lori a visit and implores her to give John another chance. He promises to leave his friend alone out of respect for Lori and asks her to simply meet him at a coffee shop. Lori obliges and meets John, but instead of making another attempt to win her back, he simply states that he wants things to end well and tells Lori that he hopes the two can remain friends. While all of this was happening, Ted was kidnapped by the creep from earlier and has been taken back to his house to serve as a plaything for his equally creepy child. During a heartfelt conversation with Lori, John gets a call from Ted, informing him of the bear napping, and both John and Lori rush to the aid of the teddy bear. What follows is a reasonable enough chase scene for what is assuredly not an action movie. The chase culminates with the creepy gentleman tearing Ted in two and sending him falling to the ground. With his dying breath, Ted tells John not to lose Lori, impressing upon him that she is now the most important thing in his life. Shortly after, he turns back into a normal teddy bear. John and Lori attempt to sew Ted back together, but to no avail. John is devastated, and Lori can see this. Just as John did all those years ago, Lori now makes a wish to bring Ted back. This wish works, and the foul-mouthed toy is once again sentient, and the three live happily ever after. This can either be a positive or a negative, depending on one's proclivities, but the comedy in Ted is functionally the same as the comedy in an episode of Family Guy. I'm of the opinion that, while not all Family Guy jokes land, it is not without comedic merit. The jokes in Ted do suffer some of the ills that befall Family Guy, but to a lesser extent. They are still oftentimes crass and seemingly out of nowhere, but the movie is much more grounded than an episode of the show, meaning that some of the more out-there style jokes in Family Guy are not present in Ted. Unlike Family Guy, the characters in Ted are much more fleshed out and actually relatable to one degree or another. While most people more than likely cannot relate to a sex worker taking a dump on their floor, they can relate to the idea of having a teddy bear for a best friend, even if our stuffy doesn't do bong rips. While there are zany antics to be sure, we aren't bludgeoned to death with these zany antics because this movie actually has a plot that it's following and characters that it's trying to flesh out, and does a very good job of not letting the comedy detract from that. Speaking of the plot, the story of this movie is surprisingly quite good. It's not overly complex or anything like that, but it really doesn't need to be. If you take a step away from all the dick and fart jokes, Ted is actually a reasonably heartwarming tale about growing up. The bear could be seen to represent John's childhood and its comforts. Throughout the movie, John is struggling to leave his childhood behind and join the adult world in earnest. This is ostensibly what Laurie wants as well, but in the end she sees that part of the reason that she loves John is because the influence that his childhood had on him. Sure, she would like him to mature a little bit, but to completely remove that part of him would undoubtedly change John for the worst. In the end, we see that John and Laurie do get married, something that John has been putting off for the last 4 years. This goes to show that he has changed. He has matured. He's no longer stuck in a perpetual state of adolescence, but hasn't completely abandoned the childhood influences that make him who he is. He has struck a balance between the two, and is better for it. Other notable bits of praise that should be given to Ted include the casting and the score. Both are still very reminiscent of Family Guy, but in the best way possible. Many of the cast members of Family Guy make appearances in Ted, all to a great deal of success. The most notable of these is Mila Kunis as Laurie, whose performance was very good. Miss Kunis really understood the character, and her portrayal of Laurie and Mr. Wahlberg's portrayal of John really sold the story and elevated the movie from a standard late-night comedy to something of a bit more value. The score was also outstanding, with the opening song even winning an Academy Award for Best Original Song. The bouncy jazz numbers are quite reminiscent of the music in Family Guy, but they work well in the show, and they work well in Ted. The bad is similar to the good to one degree or another. If you enjoy the comedic sensibilities of Family Guy, you will enjoy the comedic sensibilities of Ted. The inverse is also true. If you absolutely abhor Family Guy in its entirety, Ted might not be the right movie for you. The jokes are assuredly raunchy and lowbrow, potentially off-putting to some with more conservative sensibilities. Tolerance for raunchy humor aside, there is also a comedic resemblance to Family Guy when it comes to timing. Ted certainly hits more than it misses, but there are some misses when it comes to the jokes. The bits that aren't dick and fart jokes are often absurdist-style lines that have the potential to grow tired over time, and a lot of the cultural references may go over the audience's heads. Again, the comedic stylings of this movie are very similar to Family Guy. If you don't like the show, you will probably not like this movie. It should be noted that there are also a couple instances of mild homophobia. This could be a product of the time that the movie was released, and I should point out that these instances are very mild and almost not worth mentioning. But those offended by such things will probably be offended. To put it succinctly, I would say that Ted is Family Guy with a heart. The movie is a late-night comedy with no shortage of dick and fart jokes, but underneath all of that is a genuinely good story that has something of value to say about growing up. Ted uses the allure of raunchy humor to draw an audience, and once it has their attention, makes us fall for surprisingly well-developed characters and a heartwarming story that actually has some level of profundity. This is a balance that is decently difficult to strike, but Ted manages to pull it off. As always, the question of whether or not a movie is worth watching is a largely subjective matter. I'm sure that there are some people out there that would not enjoy Ted, but I would also say that there are far more people out there who would come away from this movie having at least had an enjoyable time. There are just so many good things going for this movie that I would say that you should at least check it out while it's on Netflix.